Listen to the before and the after of the drum mix on this song. Pretty crazy, right? The second one is infinitely better. After over 12 years of mixing and teaching over 600 students in the last 2 years to do the same, I've learned one thing that makes the biggest difference. It's so important, almost 93% of my time goes into just this alone. And yes, I track my time in the studio so I could teach you guys. In this video, I'm going to show you what really matters in a mix and how to stop wasting hours mixing in circles. But first, we need to define what a good mix is. If we're looking for something but can't define it, how do we know we found it if we do stumble across it? Here are some real objective measures that I use to define what a good mix is for me. First is energy matching. We want to make sure that we're matching the energy of the song, and there's a few ways we do this. One is frequency matching. We want to make sure that the low end is just as aggressive as the high end. We don't want the low end dominating everything else in the track, or we don't want the high end dominating everything else in the track. There are obviously some exceptions to this when we're doing filter sweeps and everything else, but overall, we want to make sure that we're having an equal amount of low end to an equal amount of high end so things are sounding balanced. Next is volume. We want to make sure that the drums aren't overtaking everything else, or we want to make sure that the vocals aren't overtaking everything else. And so we want to make sure that we have a really good volume balance between everything there as well. And then we want to make sure that energy is being matched between the channels. One thing I hear from my students all the time is they'll pan things to the left or to the right, and they don't have something else on the other side kind of making up for that. And because of that, your head kind of shifts one way or the other because the mix is just out of balance. There's too much signal going to one than there is to the other. We don't want one side feeling heavier than the other. We want to make sure that there's equal energy between the two. The second metric I go for is for clarity and separation. I actually kind of oppose the idea that you need to hear each track individually, and the idea of clarity and separation is thrown out all the time. The song is meant to be heard as a whole, and in my opinion, having individual clarity from each individual instrument is not necessarily what makes a good mix. And I think having the clarity and separation is a bit of a false guideline if you don't use it properly. But I do add this to my list because it is important to be able to understand the vocals from everything else. We need to be able to distinguish the vocals from the drums and things like that. So having some separation of the tracks and having separation in the stereo image is a good thing. Just don't go overboard by feeling like you have to hear every sound individually when you play the whole song as a whole. That's not how it's meant to be heard. Think of the wall of sound that Devin Townsend uses. There's so much going on, but yet it's so beautiful. But yet there's still enough separation to be able to hear the vocals and to be able to hear the guitars and things like that. So don't feel like every single instrument needs to be able to be perfectly heard when you play the song as a whole. But this is still an important metric to track. And then the third and final metric of a good mix is translation. It needs to be able to translate through multiple systems. A good mix will sound amazing in a really well-treated studio, and it should also sound good on a pair of AirPods. And for those of you that aren't aware, if you only pull one AirPod out and put one in, like a lot of people do, it sums everything down to mono. So for those of you thinking that mixing in mono or checking your mixes in mono doesn't matter anymore, it still matters a lot. With one earbud or with small Google Home speakers or JBL speakers, people are listening to music in mono way more than they ever have before. So make sure your mix translates between all of these systems. So now we know how to define a good mix. How do we actually achieve this? Now here's where the problem lies. Most beginners spend hours and hours trying to fix things that just can't be fixed in the mix. Well, what if you could skip all that frustration and get a better mix in half the time, basically doing what the pros do? So do you want to know the difference between mix 1 and mix 2? Mix 1 used a jazz drum kit and mix 2 used a rock drum kit. Everything else in the mix is identical. I even copied over the same plugins and presets from each drum track. The only difference was the sound I used at the source. Choosing the right sounds is like designing a house with the perfect furniture. You wouldn't put an oversized couch in a tiny room in a tiny house. There may be nothing wrong with that couch, and it might be a perfect couch for a different house, but in the tiny house with the tiny room, it's just crowding everything and it's becoming too much. Choosing the right sounds is very similar. Just like that jazz kit was not a bad sounding kit, it just didn't work well in the context of a rock and metal track. So here are two things that I like to look for when choosing the right sounds. First, I like to figure out what sounds my genre is already already using. If you make a lot of rock and metal, you're going to want to find a rock and metal drum kit. You can even look up your favorite bands and figure out what drums that they use and be able to use samples specifically from that. Same thing goes for guitar and bass tones as well. Now, if you're in the pop niche, you might want to figure out what sample libraries or drum machines that they're using. Are they using an 808 or a 909? What kind of synths are they using? Are they using a Juno or are they using something else? You want to make sure that you're fitting the vibe of your genre. Even if you make a blend of different genres and you still want to sound unique, it's very important to figure out what kind of space your music is going to fit in. A lot of times I make a blend of hip hop and metal and EDM and metal. And because of that, I know what sounds work in EDM, and I also know what sounds work in metal, and I'm able to blend the two of those together. And then secondly, I like to make sure that things are sounding good before I actually go to the mixing phase. If things are really fighting with each other, and I haven't even really started mixing yet, I need to go back and choose the proper sounds. Even if I could fix it in the mix, I could just spend that time actually enhancing a great sound and making it even better. I spend almost all of my time choosing the right sounds before I even get into the actual mixing process with EQ, compression, saturation, and all of those fun things. If a client sends me some drum tracks and they aren't necessarily sounding the way I want to at the source, I'll use a plugin like Trigger 2 to sample replace the drums. So that way I'm starting with great sounds. Now, what about vocals? A lot of you guys are recording your own vocals, and you're probably wondering, how do you actually get a great sounding vocal at the source and then mix it properly and mix it in with your music so it's not sounding awkwardly alongside your music? It actually sounds like it's a part of the song. I create a free masterclass that you can watch using the link down in the description below or scanning this QR code here. Take notes. I literally give you everything. Enjoy. And as always, go create.